History is a vaccine against superficiality. Today, we're bombarded with information at a rapidly accelerating pace. The average US citizen consumes something like 12 or more hours of media every day. A relentless barrage of text, social media, emails, and information demands our attention. It's all a good day of training for a day of TED Talks. And you guys have been an amazing audience. But it also requires constant multitasking. We're asked to process information faster than ever. So, is it so surprising then that we make a lot of our decisions based on not much more than hunches or gut feelings? That we often skate over the surface of some of the biggest issues and most important questions of our time? Now, I'm a professional historian, and for the next 14 minutes or so, I want to use my 15 years of research to convince you that history has a vital role to play in our lives. Because if we don't begin to take a longer view of where we are today and how we got here, we deprive ourselves of the tools that we desperately need to not only deeply understand our present, but to shape a better future. All right, 2 years ago, I was sitting in my office at Oregon State University. I was reading, go Beavs! I was reading a New York Times interview with then presidential candidate Donald Trump, when I saw a phrase that I didn't expect to hear from anyone running for political office in the 21st century, much less for president. Now, I asked if he would describe his foreign policy as America first, and I quote, Trump said, "I'm not isolationist, but I am America first." I like the expression. The New York Times had their headline, and the administration has gone on to use this phrase for policies that range from trade to immigration to foreign policy. It's a phrase that provokes an immediate reaction, right? Whether you prefer to get your news from the New York Times or from Fox. To some, this phrase, America first, is a symbol of one of the darkest moments in US history, right? A moment when the country almost reneged on its responsibilities to the world. Now, to others, it's a straightforward declaration of what you might think is should be any nation's policy for itself and for its people before others. And America first will always be a symbol of another, perhaps even more loaded word, isolationism. Now, in the course of America's history, we have, like all societies, grappled with questions about our role in the world. Who should benefit from US involvement in trade, or diplomacy, or war? How should the nation balance domestic and foreign commitments? At home, who counts as an American? And what's the right approach, say, to immigration? Now, I have to clarify, I'm no isolationist, but I am a scholar of the subject, and I've seen how isolationism has lost almost all of its meaning today. As a word, it's been mangled, it's been maligned, and it's been mistreated. The term isolationist is often hurled at political opponents as a weapon, regardless of what position they take. It's been caricatured for decades by the image of a cowering ostrich with its head in the sand, rather than a soaring eagle, and it conjures up notions of a fortress America. But what lies behind that lightning rod of a word? As a specialist in the history of ideas, when I see a word like this, the question I ask myself is, what's the story behind it? In the case of isolationism and America first, I think it's a story that America has collectively forgotten. And in a country that feels more divided than ever, what better time to look beyond our immediate sort of reactions and to dig deeper, to search for greater understanding. So, let me tell you a story of isolationism, a story of America first. As with all good stories, this one begins at the beginning, or near the beginning, of the United States in the 1790s. With the scale and scope of American power today, it's hard for us to really grapple with and understand and imagine that time. The US was a fledgling democracy with fresh wounds from the Revolutionary War. European powers still hungrily eyed American territory. Vultures swirled, the baby eagle was vulnerable. which led George Washington, in his farewell address of 1796, to set out a vision for America's future in an uncertain world. The US should, he said, steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Now, this pillar of American foreign policy would stand for more than a century. America would be neutral, and with good reason. Better, Washington argued, that the US should use the natural barrier of the Atlantic Ocean to stay out of European power politics. And meanwhile, the US should concentrate on building the future of the nation at home. Just 5 years later, in his inaugural address, Thomas Jefferson set out a second pillar of American foreign policy: unilateralism, especially in trade. He promised his presidency would bring peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations and entangling alliances with none. Jefferson proposed to develop the American economy, especially agriculture, and to focus abroad on opening up new markets for American goods. 20 years later, the US was a rising power. The policies were working. But the eagle was still vulnerable. The nation still weak. President James Monroe recognized this fact in 1823 in his State of the Union address that established his doctrine, a so-called third pillar of American foreign policy: non-intervention. He would keep the US out of European business and wouldn't go out in search of monsters to destroy. These three pillars of American foreign policy, neutrality, unilateralism, and non-intervention, dominated the 19th century. Forged by three founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and Monroe, they also are the cornerstones of isolationism. So you might be asking, what happened next? Well, for a long time, nothing much. These pillars of isolationism stood strong, even at the start of the 20th century, when the US finally had sufficient military and commercial power to take action on the world stage. Voices from across the political spectrum urged caution in international relations. They worried about building an American empire. They maintained that the focus for the US should be inward, on fulfilling ideals at home. And when the US stepped outside neutrality, unilateralism, and non-intervention by supporting Britain and France during the First World War, it was hotly debated and deeply unpopular. The backlash that came after the war led to an even greater caution in foreign affairs, what we might call the heyday of isolationism. Now, in this era, America was still hardly walled off from the world. Trade and exchange flourished and continued even during the Depression. But since many thought the US had been driven to war by protecting US business interests abroad, Congress in the 1930s passed a series of so-called neutrality acts. These aimed to prevent a US president or special interests from taking the nation to war without wider national consent. Soon after that, at the turn into the 1940s, this is when isolationism reached its popular peak in 20th century America, with the emergence of the America First movement. It included members from all walks of life and all beliefs, Republicans and Democrats, socialists and industrialists, farmers and corporate executives, military leaders and pacifists, and even involved the kids of wealthy families who'd go on to be, for example, presidents, Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, and secretaries of state. The America First Committee supported those same neutrality laws, and they turned to Washington and to Jefferson and to Monroe as they opposed President Roosevelt in his planned support for Britain against Nazi Germany. They argued that the US should remain entirely neutral, that aid to allies like Britain and France only weakened America, and that no foreign nation would attack the US if the nation pursued coastal defenses and air power. In short, they made a powerful appeal to American exceptionalism. Yes, these were arguments fueled by a fear of strangers, of others. Yet they were also animated by core principles with long-standing roots. And while the committee officially disavowed anti-Semitism, it provided a public platform for prominent Nazi sympathizers, turning a deaf ear to fascist and anti-Semitic speeches in the parts of the country where they seemed to be working. And it was working. By the middle of 1941, America First was the largest foreign policy lobby ever formed in the United States, with hundreds of chapters across the US and nearly 1 million members. In November of that same year, Germany stood across and occupied Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France had all fallen. Britain had been heavily bombed, and German troops were advancing through Russia. A poll taken in that same month, November 1941, showed that a majority of Americans still opposed involvement in the war. But we know what happened next. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor changed everything. 4 days later, the America First Committee disbanded, and with the nation attacked and in peril, its members joined Americans of all backgrounds to rally to the flag and to the nation's allies. But America First's legacy continues to haunt isolationism. Regardless of whether it's fair or not to think of the America First Committee as essentially racist or anti-Semitic, it passed into public memory as a right-wing, racist, hyper-nationalist organization. America First had been tarred forever, destined to disappear, or so it seemed. Because just as an attack on US soil ended the America First movement on December 7th, 1941, another attack 60 years later on September 11th, 2001, rejuvenated isolationism in America. At the dawn of a new century, security threats and terrorism, nuclear proliferation and weapons of mass destruction, a brutal recession, rising inequality, rapid globalization unleashed a perfect storm of new patterns, of new tides flowing across the nation's borders. Before long, history came flooding back with a renewed cry for America First. Today, there's a budget with this name, a series of policy statements. There's even a political action committee with this name. And every political commentator has the phrase ready to use, either in strident attack or in firm defense of this administration's policies. But this use of the phrase America First as a weapon to promote one position and to demonize another erases the crucial historical context. It diminishes the vital questions and principles at stake in US foreign policy. How should America engage with the world? In trade, in diplomacy, in culture, even war? What is the meaning of America? As we've seen, these questions are always in flux, always changing, and never truly apart from the world. So I'd like to suggest that the real symbol of isolationism is not that cowering ostrich with its head in the sand, or even a mighty fortress, but a sand castle. Always permeable, always contingent, always developing. America has been and continues to be infused by flows of new peoples and new projects in this amazing project of American democracy. The tides of trade, immigration, conflict, and culture wash over the nation's borders today as they did in the past. As we've seen and as we see here, the nation has never been and can never be fully walled and bounded. There can be no impenetrable castle, no uncrossable moat around the US. So we should think of Uncle Sam and his sandcastle, and we should be reminded of this longer story and of the importance of context. After all, Washington, Jefferson, and Monroe weren't trying to cordon America off from its neighbors. Instead, they were looking for the right ways to engage in and with the world. Isolationism, it turns out, is not what most people think it is or was. History reveals it was always as much about border crossing as border making, about the hard choices that must be made over the US's role in the world, and how these commitments abroad affect society at home. The story reveals something else, something I think is vitally important to our role as conscientious citizens and as committed members of society. Without history as a guide, symbols, terms, and words can be easily manipulated. They can be deployed as persuasive brands of a sort that push us to accept a position uncritically. They're hard to interrogate. They're hard to resist. So taking a breath, taking a look, taking the long view, that's always been essential to weighing up our choices. But arguably, today, it's more important than it's ever been. It can serve as a safeguard against the speedy, simplistic thinking we're forced into if we allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the constant flow of information. History is a vaccine against superficiality. History can also be our bridge. It links the questions we face today to their echoes from the past. So let's turn the information age to our advantage. After all, we have more access than ever to the rich diversity and complexity of the past. Let's use the resources at our fingertips to reject oversimplification. We need to know about the tragedies and the transgressions as well as the triumphs. Stories, often long forgotten, the fragments of which, words and phrases like America First and isolationism, can be wielded as weapons. But when we take the time to unearth the full story, time to understand it, we gain a new depth of insight about who we were yesterday, who we are today, and how together we can create a better tomorrow. Thank you.
You want to do this?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Just quick shout out to Pete Lewis and Fordham, a team that helped put this together. But back to Jonathan Case, it's about 150 hours of illustration just for this presentation. And Jonathan's in the audience.
A hand for Jonathan Case, please. Thank you.
And to this gentleman, he's used to doing 55-minute lectures to get it down. We would say we got to take out 2 sentences, and Christopher would add 2 paragraphs, and so we had this amazing ping pong match. But to more important matters, we wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to your father.
So I lost my mom earlier this year, and my dad is fighting cancer right now, watching. And I just want to say, you're an inspiration. I love you.